My predecessor, who I disagreed with on a whole host of issues, still had a basic regard for the rule of law and the importance of our institutions. What we have seen over the last couple of years is a White House enabled by Republicans in Congress and a media structure that supports them. That has not just differed in terms of policy, but has gone at the very foundations of who we are and who we should be. What makes me optimistic is the fact that there is a great awakening going on around the country, particularly among younger people who are saying not only are they fed up with the shambolic, disorganized, mean-spirited approach to governance that we've seen over the last couple of years, but more than that, are eager to take on some of the core challenges that have been facing this country for centuries.
Former President Obama on the virtual campaign trail with Joe Biden for the first time yesterday. You heard President Obama mention the rule of law, and there are a number of developments this morning concerning Attorney General William Barr. Professors at Barr's alma mater, George Washington University Law School, say he has failed to fulfill his oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. In a letter issued on Tuesday, 65 faculty members outlined the actions they believe, quote, undermined the rule of law, breached constitutional norms, and damaged the integrity and traditional independence of his office and of the Department of Justice. That's damning. They are the summary of the Mueller report, the sentencing of Roger Stone, the case of Michael Flynn, and the clearing of Lafayette Square. The professors and faculty conclude their 6-page argument writing, quote, Attorney General Barr has besmirched the basic values of our law school and the legal profession. The letter was released as a campaign to have Barr stripped of his honorary degree is gaining momentum. Willie.
Meanwhile, Mika, at a House Judiciary Committee hearing later today, a federal prosecutor plans to testify that Attorney General William Barr and his top deputies gave inappropriate orders on cases in an effort to cater to President Trump. Yesterday, the committee released the prepared remarks from Aaron Zelinsky, an assistant U.S. attorney in Maryland who worked on the Mueller investigation into Russia's influence in the 2016 election. In his opening statement, Zelinsky discusses the DOJ's change in its sentencing recommendation for Roger Stone, writing in part, what I saw was the Department of Justice exerting significant pressure on the line prosecutors in the case to obscure the correct sentencing guidelines calculation to which Roger Stone was subject and to water down and in some cases outright distort the events that transpired in his trial and the criminal conduct that gave rise to his conviction. He goes on, what I heard repeatedly was that Roger Stone was being treated differently from any other defendant because of his relationship to the president. I was also told that the acting U.S. attorney was giving Stone such unprecedentedly favorable treatment because he was, quote, afraid of the president. Zelinsky will testify that he raised his objections with superiors and then resigned from the case when they filed the change in sentencing recommendation despite his protests. Joining us now, former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, Joyce Vance, and former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan, Barbara McQuaid, the BBC's Caddy K, is back with us as well. Great to have you all with us. Joyce, let me begin with you, and we'll start with Aaron Zelinsky and that testimony we'll hear before the House Judiciary Committee that there was pressure exerted from the Justice Department and, in fact, from the Attorney General himself to cut Roger Stone a break. Let's just start because we've seen this sort of stew of corruption over the last few years. How unusual is that kind of pressure in your experience?
I don't think unusual begins to catch what's going on here. It's unprecedented. I spent 25 years at DOJ. I can't think of a single case I was involved in where political pressure was successfully brought to bear. If there was even a suggestion of it, everyone in my office, from the U.S. attorney down through the supervisors to the line prosecutors, would have slapped it down and found it to be unacceptable. And you know, what we say at DOJ is that we prosecute without fear or without favor, Willie. And now what we see is that prosecutions favor the president's friends, and people who are opposed to the president have to live in fear of what he might direct his Justice Department to do. The Justice Department is meant to be independent of the White House. Under Bill Barr, it's succumbed to becoming nothing more than a tool for the president to use. And that's not to take away from the work that the prosecutors across the country do every day and do with a high level of integrity. But in these key sliver of cases that impact the president's personal interests, his attorney general has subverted the work of the Justice Department. He needs to resign. He won't resign. He should be impeached.
And Barbara McQuade, as you look at this based on your experience, and you think basically out in the open, you have Attorney General Barr and the Justice Department putting its thumb on the scale in this Roger Stone case, and I guess not thinking that anyone like Mr. Zelensky was going to raise his hand and say, wait a minute, there's something that stinks here. Have you ever seen in your long experience anything like this?
No, and I agree with what Joyce just said, and I'll add that not only is this a divergence from the norms, it is specifically prohibited under the Justice Manual. This is the Bible that applies to every Department of Justice office across the country. It is something that new prosecutors are taught when they join the department. And one of the things it says is that decisions should not be made on the basis of political association, activities, or beliefs. That is a basis for misconduct. If anyone besides the Attorney General were involved in this, they would be reported to the Office of Professional Responsibility for misconduct. And one of the things I'll be looking for today is for Aaron Zelensky to name the supervisors who were involved in this chain of command, who suggested to him that he go along to get along. It's not just inappropriate, Willie. It absolutely destroys the independence and integrity of the Justice Department. I think that's why Joyce and I and all of our colleagues around the country are so outraged to see the Justice Department being used as a political tool instead of the temple of justice we think of it. Attorney General Loretta Lynch used to always say that the Justice Department was the only cabinet agency named for an ideal of justice. And that means something. We care about it deeply, and this deeply offends us.
I want to back up a little bit and ask both of you about the firing of Berman last Friday. What exactly that move sort of telegraphed to you as to what exactly the president or the attorney general was doing? And in terms of how it ultimately played out with his second in command, I believe at least temporarily taken over, how worried are you about the investigations and the work being done there perhaps being botched? Joyce, I'll start with you.
Well, Barr seems to have really taken a shot and missed with this one, Mika. Now it looks like the public spotlight will shine on the Southern District of New York. U.S. Attorney Berman has been successful in maneuvering so that his deputy will take over, probably until there's a Senate-confirmed new U.S. attorney for the Southern District, which seems very unlikely here. So he's been successful in that sense. But the real problem here is this. The Attorney General of the United States lied about that firing. He said that Berman was stepping down, said he had been offered other positions. And Berman publicly refuted that. He took to Twitter to refute that. And the question that we're left with is, why would the Attorney General of the United States lie to the American people? What interests of his, or perhaps the president's, are so very important that he took that risk of exposure, and almost certain risk, quite frankly? Maybe he thought he could slide this in late on a Friday night or in the wake of other folks leaving DOJ on this same timeline. But he has to have known that there was risk that his lie would come to light. Now Congress has to ask him, maybe the press can uncover, what is it that the Attorney General's trying to hide from the American people?
Barbara, your take?
Yeah, I agree with everything Joyce just said, and I think this is an example of William Barr miscalculating that a bullying tactic would work. It makes me wonder, when have bullying tactics worked? Are there other instances where he did similar things to other people and they did go along? But in this instance, Geoffrey Berman did not go along, and by standing up to William Barr, he got, I think, a significant victory there. Instead of having a hand-picked U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, he now has his deputy, Audrey Strauss, a career prosecutor, running that office. And I think that gives us confidence that she will run it with independence. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that her boss is still William Barr. And so even if she continues to lead investigations in that district against associates of President Trump or Trump's organization, at the end of the day, William Barr ultimately controls what gets filed out of the Southern District of New York, in the same way we saw them file this sentencing memo for Roger Stone, reducing the recommendation and moving to dismiss the Flynn case. William Barr is still the boss of the Justice Department. And so until he is removed, I don't have a lot of confidence of anything coming out of this Justice Department.
Katty Kay.
Barbara, I was just going to ask you, what can Democrats do, if anything? I mean, Jerry Nadler has already said that it's a waste of time trying to impeach William Barr. Do they have any other recourse here?
Well, I think one thing is just exposing the truth. Transparency is very important at any stage of democracy. Like today's hearing in front of the House Judiciary Committee, Aaron Zielinski and other colleagues from the Justice Department are going to detail some of these acts of improper political influence at the Justice Department. I think at some point, if the facts become too overwhelming and too awful to bear, you could see pressure on William Barr to resign. We saw this with Alberto Gonzales in the Bush administration when it was exposed that he was improperly firing U.S. attorneys for political reasons. I don't know that William Barr has the same sense of shame or decency that Alberto Gonzales had, but I think at some point it becomes untenable for him to remain as the Attorney General when you see things like the letter that Mika read earlier from the Georgetown University Law School. At some point, the pressure becomes so overwhelming, it becomes impossible for William Barr to do his job, and we could see resignation.
Yeah, that letter from George Washington University Law School, damning. Joyce, your take? I mean, are things beginning to close in on Barr?
I think Barr is exactly right that anybody with shame would resign at this point. If Barr loved the institution, he would resign to protect its integrity. But I think ultimately it's going to be up to Democrats to expose the conduct. And the hope will be that public sentiment will be so strong and so overwhelming that Barr will leave the Justice Department, or at least be so damaged that there will be public awareness and a spotlight on conduct so that the Justice Department can slowly begin to rebuild after November, hopefully.
Former U.S. attorneys Barbara McQuade and Joyce Vance, thank you both for being on the show this morning.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.